I'm Mindy Romero. I'm the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. You have more people coming in. Welcome. No worries. We today are going to be talking about voters' concerns around election interference in the 2026 midterms. This is the second in a series that we're having here at the Capitol. Every couple of years, we'll do a speaker series, briefing series on topics that are urgent, that are in the news, or often commented on or discussed not only at the Capitol level, but in Sacramento and beyond. Things that we think that we might be able to be helpful in terms of adding to the conversation. So we are nonprofit, nonpartisan research center, of course. We don't take positions on bills, but we're here to disseminate information and to help encourage conversations that we think are important. So that's the purpose of the series this time around, the 2026 Capitol Briefing Series. And today's title formally is Voters' Concerns Around Election Interference in 2026. What to expect, and specifically, what will California's response be? So we have an esteemed panel. I won't give full introductions because I know all of you have their bios if you're registered. But of course, we have Assemblymember Gail Pellerin, who I know all of you probably already know, but not only as an Assembly member, she chairs the Assembly Elections Committee and is a former registrar for Santa Cruz County and very respected in the field. So thank you so much before you came to the Capitol. Yes. And we have here also Brittany Stonesifer, who is the Voting Rights and Redistricting Program Manager for California Common Cause. And Brittany also has been in the California voting rights democracy space in California for quite some time, formerly with ACLU, other organizations, and now Common Cause is really fortunate to have her. So thank you very much, Brittany. And then also we have Gowri Ramachandran. She's the Director of Elections and Security, Elections and Government for the Brennan Center for Justice. Hello, welcome in. Also an expert in this space in California, but very much across the country, and will be able to give us a broader perspective with the work that is happening and the conversation that's happening around the country around election interference. So thank you, all three of you, very much. Let's jump in, shall we? All right. First question. Please, and I'm going to actually address this to Assemblymember Pellerin first. Please set the stage for us in terms of the current public and media dialogue around this topic in California specifically. What are some of the concerns being heard from voters and others about possible election interference in this cycle?
Hi, how's everybody doing? Yes, we are certainly living and leading in extraordinary times. Personally, in my career, 27 plus as a county elections official and 4 years now in the Assembly, and tried retirement for a little bit and that didn't work. But it's just, I've never seen so much assault on democracy and efforts to thwart elections and, you know, just the spreading of lies and deceit. Certainly we saw it in 2020 when there was called into question the legitimacy of the election. But, you know, I think overall people are concerned, but they're also feeling resilient, and they're feeling powerful where they have this powerful tool, your vote, your ballot. And one thing that we need to make sure is happening is that we're getting the correct messaging out to people as far as how they can respond. And, you know, we've had a number of court cases. I mean, the Louisiana versus Calais that came out, that was devastating. It was devastating to see the Voting Rights Act just, you know, squashed. You know, people have said that they went to bed and it was 2026. They woke up in the morning, it was pre-1965. And the fact that there is a full-on assault against Black districts in the South, and that they're doing everything they can to reduce that voice, that is not the democracy that I fight for and that I believe in. Because we need to make sure everybody has a seat at the table and all voices are heard. And you know, in California, we've done a number of pieces of legislation around this space. I think there's more room for me to talk about that later. We could get more detail on the legislative, but we are, you know, fighting back on the overreach of this federal administration to put out executive orders stating, voting by mail is no longer a legitimate means of voting, and that to basically say we're not doing that anymore, when in fact that is the method of voting that the president has used. So, and then calling into question the ballot integrity and seizing ballots from a county registrar. Again, that I've never seen anything like that happen. A bogus court, warrant to go and seize those ballots. And then that breaks that chain of custody, so we can't trust the legitimacy and authenticity of those ballots anymore because we don't know where they were and who had access to them and what could have happened to those. And then, the constant, trying to get the voter data and trying to nationalize elections and, threatening to put ICE agents out at voting locations. So we're getting the attacks at every level. And I think in a world like this, our best course of fighting back is to speak out, to stay strong in our position, and to not give up, to not let that keep us from voting. So I've been trying to message to voters the importance of voting in, I'm always about voting in every single election, whether it's just that little special district election that's got a little tax on the measure, or it's voting for president. All elections matter. They all impact your life, your neighborhood, your family, and every vote counts. So, but we want to make sure, if you want to be 100% confident your vote is going to count, you're going to drop off that mail ballot envelope in a county drop box. That eliminates any kind of travel in between you going to the postal service and then the elections office. If that's not possible and you have to mail it, by all means, do that. I feel very strongly in our United States Postal Service. I know our county elections officials meet with them prior to every election, talk about what's going to happen, what are the deadlines, how much mail they're going to see, and then they do a debriefing afterwards. So there's a good partnership and collaboration. But there's been a lot of changes to USPS where those processing centers have moved further away. So if you drop your ballot in a mailbox on, could even be like Saturday before the Tuesday election, I can't tell you in 100% certainty it's going to get postmarked, in time for election day. And then there's the whole question with the Mississippi case about whether Postmark Plus is even going to be viable anymore. But so I'm telling people, if you're going to mail it a week in advance, and that's coming up on Tuesday. And that way we know it's going to get into the mail cycle, it's going to get the postmark, and it's going to get to the county elections official. Or if you're having to do it close to Monday or Tuesday, I would walk it into the post office and have them put the postmark stamp and watch that being done as the ballot enters the mail cycle. But again, dropping it off at a county drop box is the best method. Voting in person, always a great method of voting, something all of us did a long time ago. Now 80% of our voters like the convenience of voting by mail, including myself. But I also did a piece of legislation to help people who, I have friends that like to wait to the last minute, and they don't really want to go into the polls and go in the voting booth and vote their ballot. They want to do it from the comfort of home, but they want it counted election night. So we did a bill that basically allows, if the county authorizes it, and I think many do, but I know Los Angeles doesn't, they're not set up for it, but a voter can take that ballot they voted from home, walk it into the voting location, sign a document, get keyed in as an in-person voter, and then you just walk right to the ballot box and you drop it in the box and you're done. So my daughter utilized that method of voting a couple elections ago, and she knew on election night when those tallies were reported, she was part of that. So, I think that whenever we talk about elections are a human process. We have human beings that have, created these voting systems. We have humans that are testing the voting systems. We have humans that are doing the ballot layout and designing the voter guides, and we have human voters. And so all of us need to take a piece of this responsibility to ensure our elections are fair, that they're accurate, that they're accessible, and they're secure. So we're all in this together, and I think that that's my hope for the future here, with keeping us all together.
Brittany.
Well, it's hard to follow that, but I think I would plus one to everything that Chair Pellerin said, and I think we saw Registrar Pellerin in there too. That was a lot of great information. Common Cause does an election protection program for every statewide election, and so some of these things are bleeding through to what we're training our volunteers to monitor, what we're putting in our questionnaire, and I think the line between real threats that are upon us and the threat of threats, the perception of threats, gets really blurred. And there's a lot of misinformation out there among voters about what's actually been passed, what the rules are. We have, of course, seen ICE and National Guard deployment in California, not at the polls, but we are prepared for that, and a lot of folks are concerned about that. And even if it doesn't materialize, there's obviously a disenfranchising effect from scaring voters out of participating in the election. And this builds on voters who are already disenfranchised and falls the hardest on people who are already marginalized in our democracy, because when we layer all these barriers on and then make things potentially dangerous and scary because there might be law enforcement or private actors intimidating voters or electioneering at the polls, it's just another reason to say, like, does my vote even matter? Is it really worth it? And that's really the goal of all of this. Threatening to send ICE or National Guard to California really does the job of disenfranchising the people who are saying that in our national politics are trying to disenfranchise so they can seize and hold power. This has also gotten a local flavor. Chair Pellerin alluded to a specific county that has recently seized all of the ballots from the 2025 special election. And that had so many layers to it as well. It was fueled by a local community group that itself was driven by misinformation about interference. And through that, they created interference. So it has this self-perpetuating quality to it where people seize this narrative that is absolutely demonstrably false about the security of our elections and then use it to actually undermine the integrity of our elections by disenfranchising folks and by marginalizing people who are already left out. And I just wanted to pick up on the USPS threat as well. This is something that started last year. The facilities more than 50 miles, mailboxes more than 50 miles away from a processing facility might not get a postmark. And people don't know if the executive order has gone into place yet. Of course, it has not. It's on legal halt, but if the executive order requiring ballots to arrive by election day goes into effect between the June and the November election, that would have an enormous impact on California. There are hundreds of thousands of ballots that arrive in each statewide election between that election day and the 7 days that it's allowed to arrive right now. So changing that would require a massive amount of investment in public education and making sure that we are putting more drop boxes in communities, for instance, and also putting the USPS in a political role is inappropriate. The USPS doesn't want to be in that role. We have historically been able to trust the USPS, trust our local mail person, and putting them in this position where they might have to decide who's eligible, who gets to vote by mail is just totally inappropriate and has cascading effects to undermining trust in our civic infrastructure overall.
Thank you. All right, Gowri, what is driving these conversations in California? How do they connect to the larger national dialogue about election interference? We're not in a bubble.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I wanted to sort of start with on that front is this case in Riverside County where we had the sheriff seizing the ballots from the 2025 special election. That was really a case of a sort of local actors copying what's happening and being driven by the federal government and by the current federal administration, unfortunately. So before that incident in Riverside County, there had been a couple other similar incidents that were driven by federal investigators in other parts of the country that were really pretty clearly, the same sort of, playbook was being followed here in California. So in Fulton County, Georgia, there had been a really dramatic FBI raid of this warehouse that's used actually both by the clerk of the court in Fulton County and by the county elections office. It's a very large county, Fulton County. It contains, most of the metro Atlanta area. And so obviously there's the storage facility for things like ballots and court papers and that kind of thing is huge. And it's shared between the two of them. There was this FBI raid seeking all of the materials from their 2020 election. So that is more than 6 years old at this point, right? All the people who won their contests in that election have pretty much finished their terms. Like, that's how old it is, right? So it's not even that all those people have already been seated and started performing their service. They've actually finished the term for which they were elected. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was sort of there on site inexplicably, perhaps to make it seem like there was some kind of like national security or foreign interference that was being investigated. It turned out all of that was not true. The county eventually moved to sort of unseal the affidavit that the FBI had filed to try to convince a judge to give them this warrant to seize all these materials. There's nothing about foreign interference in it. And in fact, just like the Riverside County case, it basically drew on all these conspiracy theories that have been percolating around Fulton County ever since the 2020 election, and all of which have been sort of investigated and debunked and refuted multiple times, whether in the courts or by a Secretary of State investigation, an audit. There's just been so many investigations, all that have been debunked, and that was the basis for that raid. There was also a similar grand jury subpoena for materials in Maricopa County, which is the biggest county in Arizona that contains Phoenix, also for their 2020 materials, right, like 6 years old. So I think, what's driving this conversation in California is just essentially that we're not immune from all the things that are happening at the federal level and all the other things that Assemblymember Pellerin and that Brittany have mentioned, things like ice at the polls. But one thing I want to emphasize is that people are fighting back against this. People are doing something about it. They're not just letting things happen. So, for instance, with these ballot seizures, the county has filed that motion to get their ballots back in Fulton County. There was a grand jury subpoena in Fulton County to get all the names and personal information of every single person who worked or volunteered on the 2020 election there. So all the poll workers, the truck drivers who were driving the machines and the ballots around, all of that. The county has moved to quash that. It looks like, grand jury proceedings are secret, but it looks like there's been no order saying, like, no, you got to hand that information over. Looks like it's probably going to go well for the county in that case. The executive order that Brittany talked about that tries to interfere with people's mail ballots, claim that the Postal Service should only deliver ballots that are where the voter is kind of on a special list that the DOJ has come up with. That's been challenged in court. I should disclose the Brennan Center. We're one of the litigating groups challenging that. The first executive order that tried to make people do things like bring a passport to be able to vote, which 21 million citizens in the United States don't have, our research has shown, that has been challenged and has been enjoined in court. So people are pushing back on all of these things. And I do want to mention the pushback on this kind of threat of ICE at the polls, because I know that is really, as someone here in California, I know that is potentially like really, really intimidating. Groups like the Brennan Center are preparing to run to court if that happens and file to get an injunction, a court order to prevent that. It is already illegal for that to happen under federal law. It is a crime. It is punishable by a 5-year prison sentence for a federal employee to send armed troops or armed men is the language, because it's a very old statute, to the polls. So people are preparing to sue. But obviously, it's also going to take the kind of community support and organizing that we've seen in places like Minneapolis and in many communities in California. Everyone getting together to know their rights, educate each other about all these different methods of voting that are so important, and using all those different options at their disposal. And treat voting like what it is, which is a joyful act, in my opinion. It's something where you can really have your voice heard. So if everyone treats it like a kind of community act, that's what, even more than the litigation and all of that, that's what's really going to matter.
I love that, joyful act, because it should be. It is, right? It's expressing, demanding and expressing, right, your what you want and need on an issue be heard. Brittany, let's talk specific now to California. I know we've already touched on this a little bit, but want to just think about or talk a little bit about how likely election interference actually is in California, either for the primary, which is right around the corner, or the general, this election cycle. And what is the state doing to prevent it? And then, of course, I'll ask Assemblymember Pellerin as well.
Yeah, thank you. So it is very hard to predict what's actually going to materialize in this era. And as I alluded to in my former comment, the threat is itself, it does have real ripples and real effects in the world. And part of the work that we do is that we don't want to give airtime. It's really a fine line of preparing for the worst, but not projecting fear in a way that disenfranchises voters as well. Because if we, for instance, in our outreach go around saying, ICE might be at the polls, bring a whistle, which has been something some people have asked us. We want to be prepared. We're training our poll monitors, but we don't want to scare folks out of voting or confuse them or provide more amplification for misinformation than it already gets, because there's a chilling effect. So what we do is we prepare with our partners. Gowri and I were on a coalition call yesterday about election protection, so that we have that network all the way from the ground to people who can do election protection litigation. We're also working with state representatives, the Attorney General's office, the Secretary of State's office, to be able to provide rapid response litigation or services if needed. And we are fortunate in California to have strong networks at the state level, but we have 58 different counties, and as you've already heard, they do very different things sometimes. So for June, I think we're likely to see some small episodes of private electioneering, because that often happens. We saw that in the 2025 election, people were very close to some vote centers trying to get signatures for something I'll talk about more later, a measure that'll be on the ballot in November. That's a very anti-voter measure. And we're confusing voters. There are voters who were walking up to their table thinking it was a check-in for voting. And I think we're taking advantage of that and getting signatures, folks thinking it was the roster. We also might see small episodes of private intimidation. So for instance, Common Cause is expanding our election protection program for the first time to include count monitoring in one county, Riverside, because, again, that was fueled by a community organization that took it upon themselves to do a bad audit of the election numbers and then come to very faulty and damaging conclusions from that. So there's a decent chance that we could see those types of folks show up during the count, trying to get too close, trying to challenge individual voters, just making disruptions in the process. And those bad actors continue to fuel conspiracy theories that have downstream effects for policy changes. We are also, again, promoting accurate messaging. For November, I think there's more concern about federal interference. We've heard that across multiple states, and again, we'll be prepared to respond to it. And as Gowri said, federal presence at the polls, also local police, armed security guards stationed at election centers is not okay. It's illegal. It's a crime. So I think we also don't know, as we've referred to, where USPS will be between June and November. So I think those are the two biggest question marks for November, is federal interference and mail issues.
Mail issues. Yeah, thank you. And how people also can potentially see mail issues as deliberate interference.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Right. The misinformation or confusion around that as well. Assemblymember Pellerin, what do you see as possible on Election Day, June or November, and maybe potentially past Election Day during the counting period?
Yeah, no, well, and Brittany summarized it well. And I just want to say, just give a shout out to our Attorney General, because he has been amazing and every federal overreach and fighting back. He and our Secretary of State fighting back for the people of California, filing a lawsuit. I don't know what we're up to now, 64 lawsuits. I don't know. Yeah, there's been many. So it's incredible, that action that we're seeing there. And then Ethan, I'm going to give a shout out to you. He's our chief consultant for the Elections Committee. He is an election guru. He's been here for decades, and he's been meeting, we've been meeting with a group of people since January, talking about all the possibilities, what's happening legislatively, and just being prepared for whatever comes our way. And that's a meeting, a group with keeping communication with Secretary of State, with the governor's office, with the Attorney General's office. So we are on the job here. And we have 58 counties in the state of California. Each of them runs their own election, and I feel very confident about 57 of them. So
I
we'll
wonder
leave that
which.
there. And I'm also getting more involved with NCSL, which is a National Conference on State Legislatures, I think it is. And there's an election group that meets regularly, and we're talking about doing some federal policies that help them do their lobbying work in DC. But on the legislative front, I'm just going to go over some legislation quickly so you know what we've been working on. So I did a bill in 2024, which basically was targeting those deep fakes that basically said that if you are using artificial intelligence to create something that is materially deceptive and is utilizing elections officials, elected officials saying or doing something they have not said or done, that it would be banned. It would not be allowed around an election, and we had a time frame around that. That bill is current. That bill was signed into law, but it's now being challenged in court. So we're working, and that was 2839. We're working on cleanup legislation this year, which is AB 502, that we're trying to write language so it would withstand any constitutional challenge. We also had a bill in the last session, AB 2355 by Wendy Carrillo, that required any political advertisement that's published or distributed by a political committee to include a disclaimer if the content in the ad was generated or substantially altered by AI. Mark Berman, who's just been a champion for voting processes and election integrity, he had AB 2655 last year, which required large online platforms to remove materially deceptive and digitally modified or created content related to elections, or to label that content during specified periods. Of course, that is also pending a court challenge. We did do a bill in 25, SB 851, that ensured the Secretary of State and Attorney General are notified of cases in California relating to elections that contain a claim arising from under federal law, and that restricted the uniformed law enforcement officers from being stationed outside elections offices without authorization of the appropriate elections official, and it made it a crime to use misleading, unofficial ballot return envelopes. We'd seen that being practiced before, so we basically said that's not okay. And it clarifies the duty to certify election results is a ministerial duty of the elections official. So we're saying that is your job, you have to certify elections. This year, I did put in for a $35 million budget request for voter education and outreach. I think those funds are going to be essential as information comes in, laws may change. We want to be able to message that to voters so they're clear on what they need to do. Jackson, we just passed this off the Assembly floor today. AB 1664 responds directly to the Riverside County case, and it requires local agencies and elections officials to notify the Secretary of State and Attorney General of any warrant, subpoena, or active law enforcement investigation pertaining to election records or voting systems. And then Avila Farias has a bill in this AB 2230 that expands the crime of a uniformed peace officer, private guard, or security personnel being stationed in the immediate vicinity of a polling place without written authorization to include an officer or agent of a federal law enforcement agency. And then we're going to do it. We didn't do it today. But SB 73, a Cervantes bill, increases the accountability for the unlawful seizure or removal of ballots from elections officials, because we got to maintain that chain of custody. Prohibits unauthorized access to voting systems, voting machines, or voter data without lawful judicial authorization. And it gives the Secretary of State and Attorney General and local elections officials stronger legal tools to respond quickly when election interference threatens voter confidence or election administration. And then there's Umberg's got a bill, SB 884, that prohibits law enforcement from arresting any person within 200 feet of a polling location on election day, except for crimes related to disrupting the operation of the polling location, a crime against a person, or a crime against property. So we're busy looking at a lot of different legislative ideas. I know there's also legislation to increase the number of ballot drop boxes, which I think is a good idea if the data proves it's needed. So I think some jurisdictions are probably pretty well covered, where other jurisdictions, there might be a lack of those ballot drop boxes. But we're sitting here now in May with just really a few months before that November election. And I know as a former elections official, it took a lot of time and money to identify locations. We had to pour a cement pad, we had to install the box, we had to get the box. And I'm not even sure how quickly all this can be done. And everybody needs money. So we're in a budget crisis where everybody is very stressed for funds, and you can only do so much with the money that you have. So again, being aware of the laws, making sure if you see something, say something. You know, I did a talk the other day, and somebody raised their hand and talked about, for a couple of years now, I've gotten these 3 ballots delivered to my house, and nobody lives here by that name. And I said, well, what have you done about that? Have you returned them to the elections official? Have you called the elections official? You know, so, or give me the information and I'll follow up on it. So, you know, again, you know, it takes all of us to make sure that everything is being done appropriately. So, yeah, so that's what I have on that.
Thank you. So the answer to the question, what is the state doing? A lot.
We're trying. Yes.
Bills already in place, and bills also being considered. A lot of action. Thank you very much. Okay, so Gowri, let's talk about post-election on the national level here. So what are the possible post-election, and I know we all want to be responsible and careful here in terms of what is possible without over-alarming people, if you will, right? But what are the possible post-election scenarios nationally? So for instance, I think probably many folks here have heard there are concerns about not seating members of Congress potentially, right? When we talk about the battle for control of Congress. So please, tell us what you see.
Sure. So it's totally an understandable concern, right? Especially when you see this sort of multi-pronged effort that I think all 3 of us have been describing to interfere with elections at so many different stages, right? And I think, one thing to know is that, there's some things that the state can do to try to make sure that process where the House, receives the returns from the states who administer the elections and then seats the lawfully elected members, to make sure that process is as secure as possible. There is actually one of the bills that Assemblymember Pellerin mentioned, SB 73. It not only sort of prevents that sort of seizure of ballots without a court order, it also describes the scenario in which the House might need to inspect the ballots from an election with that word inspect, which I really, really like, because instead of the idea that if the House does feel that it needs to exercise its role to look into the actual ballots in an election, it kind of indicates that, you could do that by coming here to the election official and inspecting those ballots, right? Sort of breaking the chain of custody and shipping them off to Washington, D.C. and having them not be sort of counted and inspected by in a transparent manner with the public and both parties able to observe. That would be a disaster for sort of people's confidence in the outcome, right? And their ability to trust the ballots. And so I really like that language in SB 73 that indicates that would be the process under California law for allowing the House to inspect it. It would be an inspection, not a sort of removal of custody from the election official who's entrusted with keeping those safe. But I think more important than that actually is that all of these different attempts to interfere in the election and spread fear and doubt at every stage, that's really all about setting the stage for really extreme shenanigans like what you're speaking about, Mindy. And I think, the more that everyone really holds firm that elections, they need to be canvassed and audited and certified, and the contests done under the regular legal protocols. If the way to do an election contest in your state is to file a lawsuit, then that's what you should do, right? If the way to do it is to file, some sort of petition with the election board to do a recount, then that's what you do, because that's the procedure that's set in law. We really need to hold firm that that's the way that elections get decided in this country. We set the rules in advance, and then we follow the rules. We don't change them in the middle of the game or change them after the fact, right? And if people really hold firm in that, if then the public is able to have the confidence they need to know that some kind of shenanigan to refuse to see, based on some claim that there was something wrong with the election or there was some kind of fraud, baseless accusations of fraud, when we have a transparent process and everyone follows the rules, that's when the public can respond to that with, that's bogus, that's not true. We know what the outcome is, everyone knows what it is. It's been transparently observed and everything's been done according to protocol. I think that's the most important thing we can do to prevent that kind of scenario.
So following the rule of law and expecting all players.
Yeah,
right,
and expecting everyone to follow the rule of law. Yeah.
And holding them accountable. Yeah, thank you. Would you say that would be nice?
That'd be lovely.
But the moment we don't expect it, then, yeah. All right, moving on to my next question. So we've been talking about what's possible in terms of election interference in 2026. We've talked about some of the things that are being done, both by the state, right, legislatively, but also by groups like Common Cause and Brennan Center and other partners. Let's talk now about the impacts of all of this. So what are the immediate and also long-term consequences? We'll use the word consequences from the perceived and possible reality of election interference in California. So not just what happens, but also the perception of what happens, maybe misinformation or others, and also just the concern around what could happen. Assemblymember Pellerin, you want to take that first?
Okay, well, here's the reality. I think that oftentimes elections are determined by the people who do not vote. And we have seen voter apathy, like, oh, they're all the same. What impact does it have on me? I don't need to vote. And I think when you have election integrity questions and concerns about elections, whether they're being conducted, openly and transparently and securely or not, it gives people doubt in the process. So when people don't vote, we end up with leaders that are really elected by a minority of people. And they're not really representative of our values and the policies that we want to see in our world. And, and this has been going on for a long time. And I mean, I used to, do a lot of talks in high schools to talk about how relevant voting is and how important it is for everybody to vote. And just because you're like, well, this person, they're so similar, but they bring with them a whole army of people that get appointed to different offices and positions. So today we're living in a world here in California where we're starting to talk about offshore oil drilling again, because that is the person we elected and the people that he puts into place are supportive of that. Even though for 40 years we have been having a clean coast. We have a director of health policy who doesn't believe in vaccines. And we're seeing measles on the outbreak. We're seeing diseases that we thought were contained showing up again. So elections have real consequences. And I'm one of those people that honestly believes it's everybody's right and their responsibility to vote. And I expect you to vote. If you are a registered voter in the state of California, you need to vote. I don't want any excuse why you are not voting. There's none, zero, because ballots are mailed to you. And if you don't want to vote that way, you can walk into a poll site and vote in person. You have many days and ways to vote now. So there's absolutely no excuse not to vote. And for anyone who thinks their vote doesn't matter, talk to women who have lost their right to have control over their bodies. Talk to people who are being stripped away from their families. Talk to hungry children that are not getting food, to sustain them in a healthy environment. So yes, your vote matters. And I just feel very passionately about the importance of people voting and making their voices heard, because that is what's at stake for us. And I think, quite frankly, the damage we're seeing from this administration is going to take us decades to unwind. So we better figure this out soon.
Thank you, Assemblymember. And we definitely saw some of the registrar
Pellerin
in there too. Thank you. Brittany, I'll ask you to take this question too.
And I would say if our votes didn't matter, why would they be working so hard to stop us from voting, right? That it obviously matters. It obviously can make an impact when we all participate. That's why they want us to not participate. So there are lots of ways that the reality and the perception of all of this interference causes further disenfranchisement. I talked about that before, that although we have made a ton of improvements in California, all of these threats are kind of putting us in a place where we have to play defense a lot more. It's taking energy and time and resources away from being able to continue to try to close the participation gap that has persisted in California because of many reforms that we've made, sending mail ballots to every eligible voter, creating automatic voter registration at the DMV, same-day registration, and many more. We have seen kind of a rising of all tides, but not that much of a closing of the gap. So the electorate in California is consistently older, whiter, and wealthier than the population as a whole, or the population of eligible voters. And when we are in a position where we have to worry about ICE or seizure of ballots, or who knows what the next crazy thing is going to be, that takes away energy from our ability to focus on closing that gap and making California's democracy truly representative. So I know many of us have been working on expanding automatic voter registration, for instance, to additional agencies like Covered California. There's not a lot of ability to focus energy or resources on that right now because we're putting out fires left and right. And it also creates more space for bad policies, because even though the narrative that there's something wrong with our elections, that they're not secure, that people who are not supposed to be voting that's all baloney. But when it's repeated over and over and over again, it has an impact, not just on one side of the political spectrum, but it bleeds over to the other side as well. And it creates just enough doubt that people are like, well, maybe this policy wouldn't be so bad. And an example of that is what I mentioned earlier, is on the November ballot, there's very likely to be a measure that would require more ID, because in California, we already verify someone's identity when they register to vote, right? They provide social security number and driver's license number. And we check those databases to verify who they are. We know when someone shows up to the polls or when they return their mail ballot, who they are, and we've tracked their ballot all the way through. But because of these false narratives, these lies over and over again, people get confused about that. And they're like, what's wrong with requiring extra ID? What's wrong with it is that not everyone has access to ID. Those underrepresented people I was referring to are more likely to not have access to ID or current ID. And getting an ID, even if it's theoretically free of a fee, you have to take time off work, you have to get child care, you have to get transportation. So again, this falls the hardest on the people that those in power are actively trying to keep out of the system so that they can seize and maintain power without being accountable to the people that make up California and America. So there's lots of ways that counties manifest those things as well. So faulty voter purges, unnecessary barriers at the ballot box. So we've seen, for instance, a slippery slope to this sort of citizenship verification thing that is based in fraud narratives, that voters are being required to fill out extra check-in forms in some counties that are essentially duplicative of their entire voter registration form. And when people say, well, this isn't in my language that it's required to be translated into, or I have a reading disability, that doesn't affect your eligibility to vote, but it affects your ability to participate in the election. And we're seeing those kinds of small fires and big fires pop up everywhere, and there's more room for it because the lies are just repeated over and over again. So it's really important for us to continue to represent and reflect back how secure California's elections are, and to be strong in pushing forward to close those participation gaps.
Thank you. All right, last question here. And I'll ask you each maybe to take a couple of minutes, although I'm sure you'll want to say much more on this topic. But this is where you get if you could get your wish, what would it be? So what policy or election law changes do you think should be considered after 2026, because we know that the time was short, obviously, before, but after 26 to help build confidence and trust in elections and take this wherever you want? Assemblymember Pellerin.
Okay, because then I have to scoot out too, sorry.
Yep.
And I want to kind of push back a little bit that I think, voters do have confidence in our election. And one way to really get that is to serve in the polls. to actually be somebody who's working or being a poll watcher through one of the organizations that are doing poll watching, to really understand what is going on and get information from those trusted messengers. And I think changing the conversation around voter ID, as you said, California does have voter ID, and this proposition goes so much further and will disenfranchise voters. But more than that, it would require us to put personal sensitive information on our ballot ID envelopes, which then makes us subject to identity theft. And it also, you'll end up with long lines at the polls, which is what everybody doesn't want either. And the reality is that the fraud that's occurring, it's not, me impersonating Brittany at a polling site. It's me spreading lies and deceit on social media to convince everybody that this is the way you should be voting on this issue or another. So I feel like we're just being a little gaslighting here. There's a lot that's happening. And I'm so sick and tired of people out there claiming our election systems are fraught with fraud and illegal people voting and they're not to be trusted. And I'm sorry, didn't this election system just elect you to office? And if that is the case, maybe you should think about stepping down if you don't support the election system that elected you to that position. So can there be new ways that we can improve things? Absolutely, always. But I think California has some of the strongest laws in place to ensure not only access and security, but also, penalties for people who try to circumvent the system and and commit those types of election frauds. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Assemblymember Pellerin, especially again on a busy day for you to come today.
Absolutely.
Greatly appreciate it. And I do think your last comment there about the fact that people saying this are the ones that just got elected, that's going to make our highlight reel.
There you go. Gotta wonder. Okay. Anyway, thanks you all for
Thank you all so much.
caring. Now let's get the other 22 million in the state. Okay.
Thank you. All right. So, Brittany, take it away. What do you think? What's your wish list?
Well, I'm not quite done with my 2026 wish list. I think many of them are what Assemblymember Pellerin listed. I would also add to that the California Voting Rights Act of 2026. So that's SB 1164, which just passed the Senate yesterday and is heading towards the Assembly, and SB 1360. So those are an expansion and improvement of our California Voting Rights Act to respond to the gutting of the Federal Voting Rights Act in Calais. It includes expansions of language access and various protections for voters that we need to fill the gaps that have been left by the Supreme Court. Assemblymember Pellerin also referred to funding. This is a perennial need in California. It is all the more prescient right now, but we need dedicated, consistent funding for election administration, for voter education and outreach. When we see long lines at the polls, that's because there aren't enough resources there. There aren't enough locations, there aren't enough poll workers to accommodate the need that is presenting itself in that moment. It's great that we have so many voters who show up. They shouldn't be turned away. It's great that we have folks who turn up. They shouldn't be required to stand in line for lengthy periods of time in order to exercise their fundamental right to vote. In the long run, I think we need more registration. I alluded to that earlier. So we need to meet people where they're at, because the most consistent predictor of whether people will vote is whether they are registered. And there is a gap, just like the turnout gap, in registration. And although we've done a great job with the DMV's automatic voter registration system, we've largely touched all the people who go to the DMV at this point. It's been in effect for several years, and we've gotten people registered, we get them updated. There are a lot of people, lower income people, who don't use the DMV, who don't have a license, who don't have a car, but are regularly interacting with other social services agencies. Covered California is one I referred to before. Millions of voters use Covered California every year. They're disproportionately lower income, and there's a big overlap with folks who do not use the DMV. Why are we not automatically registering eligible voters at that interaction? And nationally, just as one of many examples that we need to Congress to step in, this is a big wish list, right? So I'm wishing here, to protect democracy and specifically to stop this race to the bottom with redistricting and gerrymandering. We need nationwide standards for independent redistricting, because all of these threats and improvements that we could address, are kind of just a drop in the bucket if elected representatives are getting to choose their voters insteed of the other way around. So yeah, that's a few things on my wish list.
Thank you. And we know it's not comprehensive. I'm only giving you a couple minutes. Gowri, please, go ahead and take us out.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to do two main things on my wish list, even though I so second all of the things that Brittany and Assemblymember Pellerin talked about, and especially funding for elections, consistent funding. You know, we have so many options that we've talked about here today to exercise our vote in California, and that's part of why I feel good about our upcoming elections, despite all this federal interference, because our system is resilient because of those options, right? If there is some sort of threatening environment on your way to the polls, you can go head to the drop box instead, right? If there's an issue with the sort of mail system in your area, you can head in person, right? There's so many options. That's part of what makes us resilient, but that all takes money, right? It takes money to install those drop boxes, to staff all of these locations. So that one is just so important. But there's two things I wanted to mention. You know, the Assemblymember spoke about the really leading work she's done on trying to protect our democracy from the threats that AI poses. And I think that is something, after we get through 2026, that I think would be a great area of focus. If I had my wish list, there are definitely potential real threats to democracy in terms of manipulation of voters through these chatbots, targeted manipulation, potentially people sort of manipulating the types of answers that people get when they ask AI for answers to their questions, and that might cause voters to get misinformation about both the voting process and different candidates and their policy positions, it's so crucial for that information to be accurate, for voters to be able to choose the candidate that best represents their values and their policies. But another area that is, kind of on my wish list is something that some of my colleagues at the Brennan Center are working on, which is they're working on these campaign finance trigger laws, they're called. So the idea behind these is, if these got into place, we'd have more of a connection and voters would feel more confidence that the people they're voting and the people that are elected to serve them actually really have their interests and values at heart, instead of corporate interests or the interests of their moneyed donors. And so what these trigger laws are they basically regulate spending by PACs, and put limits on how much they can spend. And right now, it's not possible for states to enforce those kinds of laws because the Supreme Court held in this case called Citizens United some years ago that kind of law is unconstitutional. But the point of these laws is they say, we're going to regulate spending by PACs as soon as that case Citizens United gets overturned. Right, and this is going to go into effect as soon as Citizens United gets overturned. And actually, these types of trigger laws, they were really crucial to the anti-abortion movement, their campaign to overturn Roe v. Wade. And actually, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, they pointed to all these trigger laws in different states and said, that's evidence that Roe v. Wade is not settled law anymore, or it's no longer a good law. So it's almost like these laws were actually part of kind of building the political and even legal case for overturning Roe v. Wade. And so my colleagues at the Brennan Center, I think it's really kind of brilliant, have come up with this kind of campaign for overturning Citizens United and getting us back into the business of regulating all of this spending in politics, of which there's so much, including here in California. Of course, we're all seeing in the current election cycle a massive sort of amount of spending in many different levels of the election. So that's one of my wish list items as well.
Thank you both very much. Before I officially close this out, just thank the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, who's sponsoring and our partner with this series this year, and actually the last several times we've ran a series through the Capitol. They've been long-term partners around these conversations, and we greatly appreciate that. I want to thank our esteemed panelists as well again today, and Gail, Brittany, and Gowri. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you at our next event. Have a great day, everyone.